So welcome everyone to our panel, Post-Election Living. We have three panelists with us who will be offering their comments on our recent election and then be taking questions from you through Slido, which I have here on my lap and will be passing on to them. So first, introducing the panelists to my left. First, Captain David Iglesias, Director of the Faith, Politics, and the Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. Next to him is Dr. Amy Black, Professor in the Politics and International Relations Department. And then at the end is Professor Vincent Baycoat, Associate Professor in the Department of Bible and Theology, and the Director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, otherwise known as CACE. So welcome to our panelists. And so the way we're going to do this is they are first going to give opening comments, and then I will have a few questions for them, and then we'll be taking questions from you through Slido. You should have gotten the code for the Slido, and we will proceed from there. So opening comments start with Captain Iglesias.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be here. My first comment is not a legal comment, but this is a tiring process, so I am exhausted. I'm sure
we'll get to that.
My colleagues can probably relate to that. So as the practicing lawyer who got a presidential appointment as a result of a recount in Florida, I've been following this very carefully. But the similarities are very few. In the year 2000, you had one state, and the margin was somewhere in the 700s. And this matter had to be settled by the U.S. Supreme Court, which incidentally took a lot of heat for getting involved in a political question. Had they not done that, you might have had inopposite results with the Florida Supreme Court and other legislative bodies. So the court did what it had to do. What's going on now is different because you've got recount and court challenges in some key states such as Pennsylvania and Arizona and Wisconsin. So if you say this is exactly like Florida, it's not. In fact, the burden, remember, the burden of proof is on the plaintiff. So it's the Trump re-election campaign's burden to show that the original numbers are wrong, that there needs to be a recount to get to the actual number. And they get to that through the allegation of fraudulent voting, fraudulent counting, incorrect counting. When you have a margin of 700 votes, you have a shot at it. But when you look at the numbers right now, I believe the numbers are over 50,000 in the state of Pennsylvania. That's the Biden lead. 14,000 in the state of Arizona and 20,000 in the state of Wisconsin. In my view, that is virtually an insurmountable lead. So the burden would have to be on the Trump re-election campaign to show miscounting and or fraud. In my view, having tried a lot of cases in court, I don't think they're going to be able to meet it. The evidence is simply not there. But they have the right to challenge it, and they're exercising that right.
Dr. Black, your political expertise.
My political expertise with notes, because I want to talk about some numbers. So I wanted to talk about three things to kind of open us up. First, I think it's really important to note that we had record turnout in 2020. And that's really a big story of this race. It looks like, as of right now, there's still a tiny few votes left, but we're looking at probably 66.4% of the voting eligible population voted in 2020. It's the highest turnout in 120 years. It's the highest since women won the vote and expanded the franchise. And shout out to Minnesota with the highest percentage, 79.9% of Minnesotan eligible voters showed up to vote. So we saw lots of voter energy in both parties. Record number, 101.4 million early voters. These are just staggering numbers. It all ends up meaning that Joe Biden won more votes than any presidential candidate ever at 77.5 million. Second most in history, Donald Trump in the same election with 72 million votes. This is really quite impressive. I see these numbers as good news. Even in the midst of a global pandemic, when so many of us wondered if this would really suppress voter turnout, record numbers of Americans chose to vote. Second thing, just to mention briefly, because I don't think we can talk about this election without noting it, and I kind of have a little bit of a background in survey research. There were some polling errors in this election, and I think we just have to name that and think about its implication. There are going to be lots of discussions about how we got the polls so wrong in 2020, and they were wrong. But I think it's important to remember, they were wrong in 2020, they were reasonably wrong in 2016, but 2018, we actually did quite well. The polls predicted well, so I would say that polling in elections is not dead yet. One thing I think that's interesting is that we seem to have this big problem with polls when Donald Trump is at the top of the ballot. I don't know exactly what that means, but I actually think that's significant, and we'll have to unpack that more in the years to come. So whatever happens, one of the good things I think is it does remind us that polls are imperfect measures, and they've never been perfect measures. So I think as we look ahead to 2022 and 2024, I think we'll be a little less focused on the polls. It's still going to be a very important part of the news cycle. We're going to follow who's ahead in the horse race and who's behind. But I don't expect us to focus as much on the polls and take them as so determinative. And I see that as actually a good thing, because I want voters on election day to make the decision and not the polling. The third thing to point out is we start with the good news of record turnout, the less good news of confusing polls, and then the really bad news. And that is that partisan animosity is super high. And this election shows us that the animosity, and I mean that word intentionally, sadly, it's more intense and it's more personal. People across party lines really distrust one another. The Pew Research Center, in something that came out last week, I think summarized it well. They said, the elected officials who take the oath of office in January will be representing two broad coalitions of voters who are deeply distrustful of one another and who fundamentally disagree over policies, plans, and even the very problems that face the country today. This election showed us we were divided. We thought we were divided. This proved even more than we ever thought how divided we were. Part of what's going on here, too, it's not just that there's a division, and there's a big one in what people think are the right policies, but there's this thing that we call affective polarization. There's a growing divide between people, but it's not just that they disagree with one another, it's that they actively resent, distrust, and sometimes even hate the other side. So it's kind of turned into a good versus evil. The other side is my enemy, and that is just not what we need in politics. We can disagree in politics without thinking that the other side is morally bankrupt, but unfortunately, that's what we're getting fed a lot. And the election results confirm that these problems persist and are maybe even widening. The gap between Democratic-Republican voters is vast, and more Americans are saying things like they hate those on the other side. The contested election is only going to make this worse, and the dueling media narratives that are talking about this contested election are only going to exacerbate these problems. So I see it getting worse since Election Day than better. If we want to talk about it later, we can, but the exit polls, I think, have some interesting results. Okay, I know they're polls. We want to take them with a little bit of a grain of salt. But even if you suggest and think there's some error in there, there is a wide, wide gap between Trump and Biden voters on the economy, on race, on the coronavirus. These are huge, huge differences. And just to give you just a flavor of it, the negative partisanship, for example, 68% of those people who voted for Biden said they did so mainly because they were voting against Trump, and 30% of Trump voters said they were mainly voting against Biden. When we have that much negative partisanship, that's just a sign of our division. So I think it's important that we know that this is happening, and at the same time, I think it's important to know this is happening, but that we don't have to be a part of this. I think it's great when we disagree on political issues. I love that my faculty colleagues and I often disagree respectfully and with some fun. I like that my students, some are Republican and some are Democratic. But here's the important thing. We, as followers of Christ, we can pattern something different than what the world is showing us, and we don't have to play into these stereotypes out there that the other side is on the side of the devil. So this is actually where I do see some hope. If we can go back to our Christian roots. Remember, we are all image bearers of God. However we voted, we are called to love God and love neighbor despite our politics. We have an opportunity to model that in our love for one another in the church and in our love for one another outside of the church. There's not a lot of that being shown right now, and so I do see this as an interesting and exciting opportunity for Christian witness.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Bako, give opening comments, and then the first opening question I want to give to all three panelists wanted to be about the sense of, I think, political fatigue we're feeling right now coming off of this election. And so first, Dr. Bako, your opening comments, and then you can go from there to transition to that question, and we'll go back down the line in the opposite direction. And I'll say to audience who's watching, please start sending in questions so I can give those to the panelists as well.
Thank you. The only observation I really want to make at the beginning is that it is interesting to observe the different Christian contexts where people respond either positively or negatively to what happened or what is happening, I guess, in the election. And this kind of goes to Dr. Black's point about one of the ways I think you can see the polarization happening even among Christians is the intensity of joy among certain groups of Christians when the election was called for Biden, and then the level of distress expressed by at least certain groups of white evangelicals, but not only white evangelicals. There's some black ones that are Trump fans as well. And the reason I think that's interesting to observe is that there have been other elections when people have talked about the stakes being high, and I don't recall people having the level of jubilation contrasted with the level of distress that I'm seeing from some Christians. It's really interesting. And I think one of the things that gets at is there are ways that people are really not understanding each other, and in some cases, not interested at all in understanding each other. And in a way, I think perhaps if I was going to weight that a little bit in one direction, I would say probably, minorities that voted for Biden who felt like their concerns about the Trump presidency were ignored or explained away. I think for some of them, their jubilation is, I think, a combination of, I'm glad he's gone, is part of it. But the other part of it is, I think, sort of like in your face, to all of you who, just kept explaining and then sort of ignored the things that we cared about and felt like they weren't taken seriously. And I do think that points us to a challenge about how do you get people who worship the same Lord, and if you ask them, politics excluded, basically what they believe, they'll tell you pretty much the same thing. How do those people actually respect each other, live well together, and seek the good for each other, and process whatever emotions they're going through, but not let those emotions turn them into having a disposition toward them, whoever they are, whichever other side it is, a disposition toward those people where they're not right now particularly inclined to seek any kind of, living well with those people. Because to me, I think that is a situation when we find ourselves probably more discipled by the culture than discipled by our faith. Because we've then made whatever has happened in this political and cultural reality, a bigger thing than the story that we're all a part of. So that's a concern that I have. I don't think it's an insurmountable concern, but I do think it raises the question about how churches are dealing with the ways people are influenced by discipleship from the culture. And also what kind of leadership are pastors giving to people about what it means to actually say, we've got one particular family that we're going to be with, our real forever family. And if they're our forever family, how are we acting like, but right now, I'm not so sure I want you to be part of my family. I mean, I think that's the kind of challenge that is there, but our pastors recognizing that and trying to find ways to help people to see that they need to kind of reframe and recast their perceptions of people that voted differently from them. In terms of the fatigue question, I think the fatigue is just like the next thing with the pandemic, is kind of the way I think of it. Because even just thinking about how we're getting through this semester, right? The way I've sort of perceived it is that we've been at heightened attention. Now, thankfully, we in college we've been in heightened attention, and we've basically made it. We've got 8 days before people move out. That nobody knew what was going to happen.
Many did not think we would make it this far.
What's that?
I said many did not think we would make it this far.
That's right. But part of the way we made it is by, I would say, a particular intensity of attentiveness that we've had to have. And I think we and our students and people in society at large, or at least certain people in society at large, because there are people who are just doing what they want to do, but the people that are certainly, I think, in this heightened state of attention, I think, people without perhaps wanting it to be the case, kind of getting wound up like a spring. And I think the election added to already things being wound up from the pandemic, and then the fact that the election was not called on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. Right. And by the way, Newsmax still hasn't called it for those who are, keeping track of that. Just an observation. So, but the point is that continues to turn, I think, the intensity, and it does weigh on us. But I think there's an opportunity, a Christian opportunity, in this recognition of being tired, this recognition of being turned like a spring, like a screw, being spring-loaded. And that is, it's an opportunity to ask, okay, well, what really are the resources of our faith for dealing with a world where it really shouldn't surprise you that sometimes you're wound up like a spring? Because unless you have the idea that the kingdom of God is supposed to be our completely realized experience right now, it actually should not surprise us that there are times like this. Or if we look at world history, there's been a lot of rough times in world history where people have been in considerable distress. And I think perhaps having that greater attentiveness to history, along with recognizing that we have a faith that says, don't be surprised that you feel this way. And that it doesn't just tell you that, but it also tells you to make sure that you're really turning to God, who's with you in all of this. And I wonder, and I'll just stop with this, I wonder how much of this is really a problem that in a certain way is because of the good things that make America what it is also make it uniquely unable to deal with things like this in terms of being able to deal with this tension. Why? Because we are optimistic people. We are, we're people about opportunity, and we're dealing with a lot of things that expose the fact that, well, all that you thought you could control with your will and with your motivational programs, can't do anything about it. You're subject to those things. It's really hard for people who are used to thinking that they can sort of bend the arc of the universe to their personal ambitions, to then discover that they can't quite bend this thing that is really turning them like a screw. So, so how much has that been something that we've bought into, and in buying into that, it creates, a greater sense of fatigue and tiredness.
So actually, not to cut you off, we started having questions come in. And so there's a question here that Dr. Black, I think, speaks right to your expertise. So I want to throw this to you, even as we're doing that, which is, one of the questions that came in is, what is your interpretation of the fact that while Trump lost the presidential election, Republicans made gains in the House and will likely keep the Senate?
So I think those numbers are kind of case in point about how divided we are and how evenly divided we are, right? So it looks like Trump is going to win exactly the same number of electoral votes as Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So I consider that actually 306 to what? Do the math for me. I have it written down. It's close. I consider that relatively close. The Senate, like we say, we don't know yet. It's 48-50. We're going to have to wait on those 2 special elections in Georgia. That's about as close as you can get. It could get to 50-50. I think we'll end up something like 51-49 Republicans, so that's also very narrow. And the Republican Party gained seats. We don't know exactly how many yet in the House because we still have some outstanding elections to be called, but they will have made some gains in the House. So we're going to have a small Democratic majority in the House, a small either party majority in the Senate, and a decisive but not landslide win in the presidency. So yeah, that just reminds me that we're just kind of in a very divided place. And in some ways, I think that's good because I think that actually reflects the American people, kind of where they are. But on the other hand, at least from the congressional side, the smaller the majorities in either chamber of Congress, the more intense the politics gets, and in some ways, the more we ratchet up the affective polarization. Because the sense is, it's close. If we can just anger everyone and get the fear up high enough, we can win the next election. So we don't worry about what we do for the next 2 years. We're just going to win the next election. And that's been a problem for the last really 2 decades in Congress, that we've had such narrow majorities many times in both chambers that there have been fewer incentives for people to work across the aisle. And people used to work across the aisle a lot in Congress, and they don't now. And when they don't work across the aisle, they can't agree, and then they do very little, and then we have gridlock, and then people get upset, and it just kind of spins that cycle. So this is just a reminder, we're kind of split right down the middle as a country, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, although we are split down the middle as a country, and our 2 parties are farther apart than they have been in quite some time. So I do think this is an opportunity, if either or both choose to take it, this is an opportunity for both parties to be really looking back and saying, who do we represent? Who do we want to represent? What do the American people want, and what are we presenting to them? And I think both parties have a real opportunity to think about their issues and their priorities and realigning them in ways that fit better with the American people.
I'd just like to add something to what Dr. Black said. Normally, when the top of the ticket is strong and popular, you've got what's called a coattail effect, so that lower ticket candidates win. In this case, it was just the opposite. The top of the ticket presumably did not win, but lower ticket people did. And you saw that in Arizona. So I checked with a friend in Arizona who was the U.S. attorney out there, and somebody sent me an interesting article showing a lot of down-ticket Republican support for Biden. And I said, is this true? And he said, absolutely. And he listed people at the state and federal level who were supporting Biden, but because of President Trump's comments about John McCain was a hero in Arizona because of his war record and because of his congressional record. So at least as it regards to Arizona, there was a rejection of the top of the ticket and an acceptance of down-ticket races, in which the Republicans in Arizona did fairly well, with the exception of like the Kelly race, the U.S. Senate.
Martha McSally.
McSally and Kelly, thank you.
Low cough. Figure if you're going to do a low cough, better put your mask on. So, yes, we have some questions coming in. And top of the list is from one of our own politics and IR majors, Brett Ballman, who's asked, some Republicans hoped for a repudiation of Trump's populist brand of politics, but that did not happen this election. What does this mean for the GOP's future? I should note most of the questions coming in are political, so they don't all have to go to Dr. Black.
Thank you.
Oh.
She took that as an out.
I was. I will only say a little bit because, of course, I'm not in the politics in our department. But I think, though, it shows you that there was something real that was going on in 2016. But it's also the same thing that was going on with why Bernie Sanders became popular. They both, I mean, it's kind of this mirror image thing, that they both appealed to people who felt like they were being, left out. In other words, Washington insiders, Wall Street, none of these people care about you. I see you. Both Trump and Sanders said that. Very different, proposals about what to do about that, but they both said that. And so that's why, arguably, before Super Tuesday, it looked like Sanders was going to be the guy, right? And I think people thought that there was a certain kind of populist, progressive, wave kind of thing that happened. That seems like it hasn't happened, right? But I think in terms of the GOP itself, I think it shows that whatever you're going to do with politics, you need to make sure you pay attention to the entire country, because there are people who feel like they're ignored. And so do you actually pay attention to people who feel like they're ignored? Or, do you let a reality TV person say, I see you, and then they believe that that's the outsider, and they go, well, I'm going with this person because they're making promises to me. And they at least say they see me. If you don't feel seen by the others, then, you just get more of this stoked.
And I just think, if this had been a blowout election, it would be one thing. But because it was a pretty close election, and particularly in those races down the ballot, I think this is just very much a reminder. The Republican Party is going to be fighting over this and debating over this, and it's going to get ugly. And I don't think we'll know who has won's probably not even the right word, but I don't think we'll have a sort of definitive answer until 2024, and we see who wins the Republican Party nomination. And I expect that there will be several people trying a version of Trumpism. It's going to be hard to do Trumpism because so much of Trumpism is his oversized personality, but there are going to be people going in that direction with the populist, the fear, the anger, and there are going to be others that are going to be trying to go back to the traditional Republican Party and its values. That's going to be a very long, intense battle, and we'll see. Part of the problem, of course, is that that battle will be decided by primary voters who are the most extreme voters in either party. So who gets out to vote in the Republican primaries in 2024, and what do they say their party stands for? That will be really important.
So probably the best comment I've read of what Donald Trump did to the party was called a hostile takeover. One of his sons said that on to the national media recently, and I thought, yeah, that's right. The Republican Party of Trump was not the Bush party that I served or the Reagan party prior to that. So what happens to the Trumpistas when the president leaves, but you have other individuals who might want to imitate that? I don't see that happening. I mean, after JFK, there were no Kennedys. Even Bobby wasn't like Jack Kennedy. After Reagan, Bush was no Ronald Reagan. George W. Bush was his own man. So, the Republican Party is going to have to do some real soul searching, because Trump took it on a course that only he could navigate, and now he's going to be leaving the scene. So what is the party going to stand for? And I think Dr. Black is right. There's going to be a lot of infighting over the next few years.
One thing I would just add, I don't think we should assume that Trump will be leaving the scene anytime soon. We'll see what his next steps are, but I have a feeling he's going to be a very strong media presence for the coming years.
I predict a new TV network, Trump TV, which will put him right front and center, criticizing Biden and Harris and any other Republican who might seek to usurp his prior role.
One question about Trump real quick. It's just a hypothesis of mine. Tell me if you think this is true. If it had served his narcissistic purposes, and if he had enough people who would have done this for him, would he have run as a Democrat? I mean, I feel like he would have. In other words, that whoever he could get to be the people who would be behind him, that's who would the party he would go with, because his goal isn't to be a Democrat or a Republican; it's to be, Donald Trump. Right? I mean, I'm just it just serves him to be a Republican, because those were the people that he could begin to woo.
Just on a small point on that, it is noteworthy that Donald Trump was a registered Democrat, but all the times he's ever hinted at running for president, it's never been with the Democrats. He hinted 2000 it was reformed. That's you. I know that, right to you, Vince. No, in 2000 Reform Party, and then Republicans. Even though he's a registered Democrat, that's true. He's never hinted at going with the Democrats. So on this point, and Captain Iglesias, I'll start with you. But again, anyone who wants to pick this up, and this is actually really the point where a kind of point we're on, because you're saying going with a TV network. Before we even get that far, question we have here: do you believe Trump will ever concede the race? If not, what impact might that have on American democracy, and how should the Biden camp respond?
Well, I think what the Biden camp is doing makes a lot of sense. They're acting as if there has been a concession speech. There's no law that requires a concession by the president. It's good manners. It's tradition, two things that the president rejects. So I do not expect him to formally concede. I do expect him to peacefully leave the White House. I do not expect him to be there on January 20th when Biden and Harris are sworn into office. And there is some precedent for that. There are, I think, 2 or 3 other prior American presidents that were not there for their successors' inauguration. But I do predict that the president will not go away. What is that great line from Independence Day? You will not go quietly into the night. There's no way he's going to do that. He will create a TNN, a Trump news network, and he'll be hammering away at every perceived fault that the next administration engages with.
And, I don't know, I have learned a long time ago not to predict what President Trump will do, but I think there's ample reason to suggest he may not concede. But the point to me that's much more important is, Captain Iglesias says, there's no expectation of concession, but there is expectation of a smooth transition, and a smooth transition is so important on so many levels: national security, during a pandemic, during an economic crisis, always, always important. And so I do think that members of Congress are going to tire of this soon. The GSA is not releasing the money, nor are they releasing the authorization that the Biden transition team needs to do its work, to do things like security clearances, to have access that is just essential for getting ready for this new administration. So the president may not see the importance of that, or maybe he does and doesn't want to give that to the Biden team. But we've already seen Senator Lankford is saying, from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is saying, if something doesn't happen by Friday, we're going to make sure that Vice President Biden starts getting these intelligence briefings, and I think we're going to begin to see kind of the dominoes fall in Congress, where different members on both sides of the aisle are going to do what they can in their power to give the Biden transition team access to the resources that are essential for a transition.
So this next question, I really do have to go directly to you, Dr. Black, because we really need the expertise here. Are there realistic alternative voting methods, instant runoff, et cetera, that could alleviate the polarization of the two-party system?
That question is for my colleague, Dr. Taylor, who is not on the stage.
This is his jam, yeah.
This is his jam, and I fundamentally disagree with him. The idea of something like ranked choice voting and adding to the complexity of our election just makes me apoplectic. So are there options? Possibly. But I think what we need to look for is simplicity in our elections. And what we're seeing right now is we have a simple electoral system, and we're having these debates, we're having these court challenges over an election that was very straightforward. And we even had Organization of American States sent in, at the Trump administration's request, sent in poll watchers to make sure that this was a fair election. We've done everything right, and we're still in this midst of some tumult. So I say let's just keep it the way it is. It may not be the best system, but most of the other systems that I see are far more complicated, and to me, simplicity is the best thing to keep the turnout numbers high.
A related question, Dr. Black. Some have said, and I've heard this at least since 2016, they talk about wanting to abolish the Electoral College. Right? I mean, one, how realistic is that? But two, I mean, what's really behind it? Because sometimes people will say they think it disenfranchises certain groups of people. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Yes, this comes up often, and it will continue to come up. This is then yet another election where the Democratic candidate received far more in the popular vote, and the popular vote doesn't matter. It's the electoral vote that matters. And of course, in this time, the Democratic candidate won both the popular and electoral college, but I don't anticipate a Republican candidate being able to win both in the near future, just the way the numbers look. The Electoral College is complicated. It is, like so many things in our Constitution, it is a compromise that the founders came up with when they could not agree. And like many compromises, it was probably necessary to make the Constitution work, but that doesn't mean that it's pretty, and that it doesn't mean that it's maybe the best system. So we have this compromise system that starts from the founders who just could not agree between a direct vote and having the state legislatures vote, and so they came up with this kind of in-between. They also couldn't anticipate a national media where people would be informed enough across a wide nation to make the vote. So I think there are many reasons to consider abolishing the Electoral College. At the same time, to me, and this is because I'm just practicality is where I always come down on these questions. A constitutional amendment is very, very hard to pass, and it requires supermajorities at multiple levels. So the possibility of a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, in my mind, looks impossible. So if something's impossible, I just kind of move on. Let's go to the next question. But it's an interesting question. It will come up again, and it's not something that's easily solved.
So the next question here, and in some ways, this may work better for later, but this question was asked early on, and I want to respect the person who submitted it. And so, Dr. Baycott, I'll start with you, but I think this is relevant for all of us. What are some ways that we as Christians might foster reconciliation and respect between two bitterly divided political camps?
One of the ways of doing it is Christians actually doing it together, and this being public, and not, and I don't mean like a Promise Keepers reconciliation type thing, etc. I mean that was like not a horrible thing, but if it had staying power, you would have a fundamental difference in race relations in evangelicalism right now. So, if you have people actually coming together, and perhaps major leaders coming together, talking honestly, talking frankly, not doing a simplistic situation where we agree, and then off camera somebody's like, man, get me out of here, right? But that there is actually genuine respect and genuine things that are being done in terms of partnerships together, where people show that they are committed to certain kinds of common concerns. I mean, so I mean, if you had white evangelical leaders showing up in African American neighborhoods, but they were showing up there to learn, not like they were there to inform, and they were there working with, pastors who are of prominence and respect. That I think would be one example of that. I think another way, though, honestly, it would be very interesting to see what would happen if you had people typically associated with pro-life causes showing up in African-American neighborhoods, but not talking so much about abortion, but just talking about the life experiences of people, because there's all kinds of factors that lead to reasons why people have abortions in the African American community, and of course that rate's very, very high, actually. So if you have pro-life people showing up there acting like they cared about the people, I mean, that would be very, very different. So I think seeing those types of things, they go, wait a second. These people do not usually hang out together. And I've seen those type of people, on social media flaming each other. And now they're really actually doing something. I think that would show people something other than what they are used to. They're used to people not understanding each other, having different sets of priorities, and then complaining about each other because they don't have commensurate priorities. So doing that work together, I think, would be a way to demonstrate, one, something about why the good news of the gospel is really good news and what it does to people, but also just showing that people can have different commitments but actually seek the good for each other together. So I think that would be incredible, because I think people actually want that, but the fear makes people, go hang out with their tribe.
And you could start it right here on campus in your dorm rooms and your suites. I guess that's about as far as you can get with COVID restrictions. Outside when it's kind of warm. But I mean, I'm hearing this actually from some of my students, that they're having really good conversations and that they haven't been particularly heated, and that's exciting to me. But I think we need to have these conversations, listen to people who have fundamentally different beliefs, listen to them, hear their stories, try to understand their stories instead of just telling them your side, and then they'll listen to you. And I think we can start those conversations. And if people who fundamentally disagree on politics but fundamentally agree on who they are in Christ, that's a great place to start. And so I really do encourage you as students to be interacting with people. Seek out people who think differently than you do in politics. Learn what's going on, ask them their stories, tell them yours, and we can model it really from the grassroots up. The elite modeling is important, but I think it's equally important that we do it in our own circles.
And there's that one thing that was implicit in what both of us said, the place of empathizing with other people, where people actually know that you are not just hearing what they say, but you understand why they feel the way that they feel. Because I think a lot of people, the reason they get this way is that they're pretty sure that the other person is going to make this a battle of assertions, they're going to attack, and they're not going to actually care about you. If people see that people actually understand, oh, I get why you might feel that way. I never knew you felt that way. But that's taken seriously. I think that can go a long way, because I think a lot of times the reason why we're having something other than the conspiracy of silence thing happening that Dr. Black was talking about here, in other words, that people are having those conversations is what I mean, instead of the conspiracy of silence. People are willing to put themselves in the space to be mutually empathetic. I think that's a very important dimension of it, especially because our society is so affect-oriented. I mean, feelings matter a lot, right? So, and I'm not saying that's a problem. I mean, be rational, but we're whole persons. But I think a lot of people, they feel like what they feel is disregarded. I think that's one of the reasons why there was all this stuff about an African-American sort of exodus for some people to nowhere, after 2016, because they felt like they were in these, mixed-race churches and nobody cared about what they felt like, about what their feelings were after 2016. Now, there's an opportunity in the other direction to see how people are feeling, right? And to say, well, how are you feeling about this? And to really take people seriously, irrespective of what you thought of their candidate.
Captain?
So this might seem like it's coming out of left field, but I think this is one more reason to have mandatory national service for people of a certain age, so that you're forced to spend time with people from vastly different backgrounds. I mean, I look back to my military service, and we had people from all over the United States and a few foreign countries. And you had a common mission and a common purpose, but you had to work with them. And I just think if you can replicate that, and I'm not just saying mandatory, like bring the draft back, because I know the Pentagon does not support that, but some type of mandatory service to the country in which we are requiring our young Americans to give back to not just their community, but to all the various communities writ large. I think that's a big step in the right direction.
So, Captain Iglesias, we have another question about voter fraud, so I want to start with you, and then if others want to add to it, please feel free. What do we do with Trump claiming voter fraud towards his race while accepting the results of the Congress races or congressional races that favor Republicans on the very same ballots.
So the thing to keep in mind about making claims of criminal activity is you can allege anything about anyone at any time. The allegations are irrelevant. What matters is the evidence and the proof. And can you meet your burden of proof to the legal standard required? So, I mean, this is an old whipping boy. I'm struggling to think of analogies of some phenomenon of something that people still argue about. And maybe it's the Loch Ness Monster. There are a few photos out there, so does it exist? Probably not, but there are photos. So there is some evidence. Maybe Bigfoot. So there are photos of Bigfoot, videos of Bigfoot. But what does the evidence show? The evidence shows that there's not one DNA sample of a Bigfoot. So in my experience with voter fraud is it is so minuscule that the Justice Department over the past 20 years has probably not filed more than 50 of these cases. 50 sounds like a lot until you think about the Justice Department files about 75,000 prosecutions every year. So over 1 million prosecutions over the past 20 years and maybe 50 voter fraud. That's not a problem. That's minuscule, and you know it aggravates me for a bunch of reasons I don't have time to get into. But you know, when you make allegations of criminal conduct, you better have the evidence to back it up, or you need to quietly exit the stage.
All right. Well, we've started getting a few questions about foreign policy. So I admit that's an area I'm familiar with, but I'm the moderator, so I won't jump in. So I'm just going to put two of them out there. Both of these people are named. So one from Ann Blakey. How do you expect U.S. foreign policy to change with the new Biden administration? And then once again, Brett Bauman, he's back again. And he's asking, some of America's largest adversaries, Russia and China, have been largely silent on the result of the election thus far. What are the implications of this?
So I think you should be able to answer the question even as a moderator.
I concur.
Oh, okay. So I was thrown out there. Well, how about this, Captain? You start us off if you so desire. Since we had a recent discussion, I know you have thoughts. And then as you are answering, it give me a chance to kind of give my own thoughts.
So which question do you want me to address first?
So again, Ann's is, again, broader. So how do you expect U.S. foreign policy to change with the new Biden administration? And Brett's a little bit more civic. Some of America's largest adversaries, Russia and China, have been largely silent on the results of the election thus far. What are the implications of this?
This sounds suspiciously like some questions fielded during the John Quincy Adams event, but I forgive you. So I think you're going to see a return to the status quo, and not just the democratic status quo, but traditionally administrations have engaged in globalism. They've been quick to shore up alliances with our partners in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. Trump has been famous for his America First, which really kind of throws back to Fortress America way back in the isolationist days, pre-World War II. But I think you're going to see a return to a State Department that's fully funded and fully staffed and fully engaged. So I think that can only help us because, look, folks, America is a strong and powerful country, but we simply cannot do it all alone. We need our coalition partners to assist us. Second question was?
That China and Russia have not said anything about the results. What should we take?
Oh, I think the silence is quite loud. I think it's to the benefit of both China and Russia to have a Trump presidency, someone who does not play by the rules, who thrives on chaos, for example. I think you're going to see a lot of discipline in a Biden administration. You're going to see Russia and China put in my view, the respective roles as our adversaries. necessarily our enemies militarily or economically, but our adversaries. And I could never truly figure out why Putin always seemed to get a pass with this administration. But Russia and China will no longer get passes, is my prediction.
So I think on this, because I really do want to give more time for our panelists, and my comments are very much in line with my colleagues. One of the things I often say in many of my classes, particularly in my U.S. foreign policy class, is that in some ways, people around the world are more affected by the American choice of who's president than even Americans are, because the U.S. president has so much greater control over foreign policy than he or she has over domestic policy. And so it's noteworthy that how much the election of the president affects the world, and how you're seeing, like, again, that there were bells ringing in Paris, there were fireworks in London, which also, ouch. And so just how much people are invested around the world in who the president of the United States is. And then also, what's been interesting though in the past few days is the vice versa, is how, and again, thinking about this as an international relations professor, and how we think about sovereignty, the fact that the comment has been made, I've seen several headlines that have said, more foreign leaders or more world leaders have recognized Joe Biden as the president-elect than Republican senators. And the legitimacy of foreign leaders recognizing our president. And so this is, it's actually just kind of amazing. How will it affect the global, another part of Ann's question, which I didn't read, how will this administration switch lead to a change in the global political climate? I mean, certainly, I think around the world, and I'll tie in Brett's question as well, I think including in Moscow and Beijing, people are at least giving a type of sigh of relief. Because if nothing else, Joe Biden's going to be very predictable, and if nothing else, Donald Trump is as far from predictable as possible. And even if you don't like Joe, even if you prefer Trump policy over Biden policy, as I'm sure is the case in Moscow, it's one of the things that was said even before the election is there was part of Putin that was kind of like, Trump is exhausting and also drawing bad attention to us. I think the one place where there's probably unmitigated disappointment with the election of Joe Biden is in the Middle East, among U.S. Middle Eastern allies. In Riyadh, in the Gulf, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, they are probably disappointed by this outcome. But they also are reliant on that U.S. alliance. And I think that for me is actually, in some ways, I'm more, also I studied in the Middle East, kind of more interested in seeing how that dynamic's going to play out, even more so than I am in Russia or China, where I think we're actually going to see, despite all of Trump's vagaries, more consistency of policy. I mean, I think Trump's hostility towards China is actually pretty bipartisan. Russia, yeah, that's a confusing one. But the Middle East one is the one I'm more fascinated by.
And if I can add one thing, I do think that, like we were talking about, we're moving from a unilateral foreign policy back to multilateral foreign policy. I think that move is super important and indeed is part of the reason the international response has been so positive. But another piece that I think is really important is just to note the professional expertise that we will be expecting coming out of the Biden administration. First of all, with Biden himself, he has been in Washington politics for more than 4 decades. He has interacted on the international stage with many of these leaders. So when Angela Merkel and others are calling him to congratulate him, they're not calling some stranger who just won an election who doesn't know anything about U.S. foreign policy, which is sometimes the case. They're calling someone they have worked with and that they know. And then I expect the State Department, the Pentagon, we've had lots, so Pentagon, State, the intelligence community, so many places where there are going to be lots of vacancies and has been lots of shifting. They'll be staffed up relatively quickly, assuming they can get security clearances, and they'll be staffed up relatively quickly that people who've been waiting in the wings, who've served in previous Democratic administrations, particularly many people from the Obama administrations, who are ready to come back into service. And so there will be lots of people with expertise. Again, you may or may not agree with the exact policy direction they go, but we will be seeing, I think, an administration that's full of people with lots of experience and lots of expertise to bring to bear.
So another question here, shifting focus to an area we hadn't really talked about, but it was such a major factor in our election, or certainly in our election, was the Supreme Court. So one question is, there is now a 6-3 conservative majority in the Supreme Court. What effect might this have on any of Donald Trump's cases if they make it that far? And maybe we'll start with our legal expert.
Well, and I think Dr. Black is right in saying that prediction in the political realm is dangerous, but especially dangerous when it comes to the U.S. Supreme Court. I can't tell you how many presidents who have thought they have picked a reliably liberal or conservative judge, only to find out, guess what? They exercise independent judgment. So I think we can best say we apparently have a 6-3 majority, but it really depends on a case-by-case basis. I don't think you can predictably rely on what the pundits are saying these justices will be voting. I think it's still, there's a fair amount of unpredictability in this matter. The Supreme Court is enormously important, obviously, as the third branch of federal government. But if any of these judges feel like they should recuse themselves and step down, they'll do it. I mean, we have 9 justices who I believe have the ethical compass required to step down if they think that they have a personal stake in this. So I think stand by and just read their opinions very carefully.
And I think the chance of anything making it to the Supreme Court is very small. Almost all the challenges have already been thrown out. There's one case in Pennsylvania that's now made it up to an appellate level, and that the appellate level has been decided in the favor of the Trump campaign. That looks like it's going to affect something like 3,000 ballots in Pennsylvania. So this is not, getting back to Captain Iglesias' opening statement, this is not 2000. This is not Bush v. Gore. This is not less than 1,000 votes in one state deciding an election. So that was the narrowest of narrow options, and you can understand why it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. But we're not talking about things that, I mean, looking at things on their face, the allegations that are made, even except for maybe some of the legal remedies that are just the most extreme, but any legal remedies that fit within any legal remedies that have ever been offered in election cases, there's nothing that looks like it could change the outcome of this election. So I just don't see this making it to that point where the Supreme Court is decisive, and I'm actually don't really think any of these cases will even make it to the Supreme Court. I don't think it'll get that far, and if it did, they wouldn't grant it cert.
Okay, so I want to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to take 2 questions together and make this our final question, because they almost are complements of each other. So one is, should we expect the states that flipped blue, or almost flipped blue, or soon to flip blue, to continue on the path of continuously voting blue? So really that question is sort of, we see the Democrats' path going forward. And the other question, for the 70% who voted for Trump, what were the motivations? What was it about Trump's policies that appealed to 70 million? Again, I think that's what they meant by 70%. I was kind of wondering what they mean by 70%. What was it about Trump's policies that appealed to 70 million people? So sort of thinking about blue path and red paths.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that I don't know that it's always just about policies.
Right.
I think it's about a sense, an ethos, it's the populism. I do think for some people it's they're nervous about the racial side of things. I mean, for some people they may be like very, very nice people, but I mean, like really very nice people. Okay, I'm not talking about Richard Spencer or somebody, but they are. They have some kind of fear because of demographic shifts, and at least they, the what I would call some of the dog whistle politics of Trump said to them, at least someone's doing something again that's going to kind of keep me from being obscured, and particularly I think people that are middle to lower middle class who don't want to be ignored, left behind, etc. And again, they felt seen by him, and I think they he's just like their guy, you know. So I don't know how much that's really about a policy thing. I think in terms of the people that are evangelicals, I mean, you know, whatever anybody thinks about Trump as a person or whatever, the thing is that he delivered more things that certain evangelicals have cared about than Reagan did or Bush or either of the Bushes. And he said, "What do you want? I'll give it to you." And, you know, as much of a chaos agent as he might be in other ways, he kept sort of trying to stick to that kind of thing. And I think you just can't ignore that, right? And so I think that has to be taken seriously. And I guess the other thing I would say is it depends upon, at least with some of the white evangelicals, it depends upon how much people really want to be committed to a certain version of, if we will, Trumpist Republican politics, and that's the political transaction that they want to make. And are they willing to make that transaction? Or is this a temporary political transaction for them? And then, you know, some people might be more wishy-washy.
So I'm digging on my little exit poll numbers. There's just a few things that I had typed out. You know, Dr. Baycoat is right. For many people, it's not a strict issue kind of thing. For some people, it's just a partisan thing, and that's important to know. Many voters, probably a majority from both parties, I don't have those numbers in front of me, decided who to vote for before we actually knew who the candidates were. You know, Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans. That's kind of how it works. But when we do ask people about issues, what we saw, I was mentioning how there's such stark division. The economy was a big issue for many people. If people thought the economy was going well, if they said it was excellent or good, 78% of them voted for Trump. Not good or poor, 80% for Biden. The same thing on racism. Racism in the U.S. is an important problem. 68% voted for Biden. People who said it wasn't an important problem, 84% vote for Trump. Coronavirus, the same thing. If you think it's a problem, you voted for Biden. If you don't think it's a problem, you likely voted for Trump. So there were some issues that split people in huge rifts, significant differences. So that's some of what I think was going on. And then to the blue versus red, sort of the flip. You know, I think we get really quickly, all of a sudden, I think, oh, there's the solid South, and then the solid South doesn't look so solid. Or we had the blue wall, but wait a minute, the blue wall went away. Now the blue wall, is the blue wall back? Is it a blue fence? You know, what is it? And so I think we sort of expect when there's a shift in one election that somehow we have fundamentally transformed the electoral map. And that's just, I don't think that's what we saw in 2016, and I don't think that's what we're seeing in 2020. I'll be looking, when I have time, at some of the county level data. There were many places that were Obama, Obama, Trump. So for 2 elections, a majority of voters voted for Obama, and then they voted for Trump. And it looks like quite a few of those are still Trump. So we're going to have a lot of Obama, Obama, Trump, Trump, some Obama, Obama, Trump, Biden. But this is a reminder, things do flip, and they kind of flip back and forth. Some states we know, I mean, I was trying to explain as we were watching the election results, and I said to my daughter, well, when Massachusetts comes on, it's going to be blue. And, you know, when Mississippi comes on, it's going to be red. We don't have to have the numbers from certain states to know the underlying partisanship because the patterns are deep and long-standing. But there definitely are places where we're seeing electoral movement, and we're also seeing demographic movement. Georgia, I do think, is case in point. Georgia has been a consistently red state for a long time. It has flipped blue in this election. It got super, super close in the 2018 gubernatorial election with Stacey Abrams. This is a state, to me, that's actually beginning to change. So I think we just have to be careful to not assume that once a state has gone from blue to red or vice versa, that it's forever on the new path. But a lot of our swing states are always our swing states. And some new states join the swing state category, and some states like Ohio doesn't look like it's as much of a swing state anymore. So some things become swing states and other things become more stable one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Dr. Black said. And there's a saying, I don't know who first said it, but the more things change, the more they say the same. I kind of believe that fits here. I am glad that in this election that the East Coast or West Coast did not decide the outcome. It was the flyover people. It was the people in Arizona and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that decided this election. I remember when Virginia was reliably red. Well, not anymore. But is it reliably blue? I think it depends on the candidate. It depends on what's going on in the country. So, you know, if anybody has a neat little formula to explain how things are going to be in 4 years, be careful, because I think there's still a lot of unpredictability.
I think that word of humility is the exact one to end on. So I wish there was a present audience to audibly thank our panelists, but if you did enjoy this panel and you were able to be here, shoot them an email of appreciation. And thank you for joining with us tonight to talk about an election that felt like it would never end in a year that feels like it will never end. Have a good night.